Welcome to another episode of Simply Thriving in the North with your hosts, Auroara and Brent Goerz. We have a very special guest here with us today, Bruce Allan. And I do want to honor that we are on the unceded ancestral and stolen lands of the Lheidli T'enneh. And before we get into who you are and introducing yourself to the audience, is it possible we could talk about the pronunciation of Lheidli T'enneh? Because I know that I often hear this strong Lheidli, but then the late elder E.D. Frederick, I had a conversation and I said, well, I was taught that it's Lheidli, and I always hear Lheidli, and she said, yes, it's Lheidli T'enneh. And so are you able to help us learn about how did it become Lheidli?
Oh, well, I think the first settlers that came in started, they heard the language and they couldn't say any of the LH sounds like in Daketh or Lheidli or Lucas. Lucas is a really good example of that.
Like Lucas Lake.
Lucas Lake, and then they couldn't say that.
Yeah.
The LH sound, so they said Lucas, and that name still stuck today, but it's the proper pronunciation is Lucas.
Oh, well, I'm going to start saying that.
Yeah.
Lucas.
And that's the elders, they kind of, with some of their colonized education, they would do some rhymes to make people try to say the LH sound properly. Leigh as in dog.
Yeah.
It's not Leigh, it's Leigh. Leigh, fly, like many. Clum is ice. Yeah, and so there's lots of words that have that. So, and European settlers couldn't say it, so
right.
That's where that K sound comes in.
Would you say they couldn't say it, or there was some arrogance there with regards to we're going to just not adapt and listen carefully, right? Because that's hundreds of years ago, where it's just we're white, we're the ones who know everything, we're educated, blah blah blah. And
didn't want to be corrected.
Right. Right, and now the culture's totally shifted, right? Where you've got a large segment of the population who are curious and want to do things properly, want to be respectful. And isn't it language is almost like that starting block for connection?
And Daketh is a hard language to learn as a second language, very, very difficult. It's one of the Athabascan languages, and they're very complex, and the fluent speakers, would create language as they would speak, to adapt. And I'm not a fluent speaker, but I know that I grew up around elders who spoke all the time, and I could hear the words, and you can tell when somebody's not, their tongue is not there.
It needs to be lubricated.
One of my elders said, "Oh, you got a stick in your tongue." What do you mean? Well, your pronunciation is not there. So you got a stick in there. You got to take that stick out of there, and then you're able to say the words properly. Yeah. So there's a lot of people with that stick in their tongue yet. You just have to.
When did kind of the language has always been important, but when do you think it had been kind of revitalized, kind of currently to be kind of reached in the schools and in the community? Like, because you said you were around elders where that was just done, but formalizing it and kind of getting it out there. What's the time frame just within your community?
Right now, my community, Stella and Lheidli, there's a sense of urgency because there's only a handful of fluent speakers now, and they're recording, and they're creating language apps, and they're doing language classes online with several hundred people online to learn pronunciation and grammar and speaking.
So
And
before
what's-
we head down a
Sorry.
rabbit trail of all the things, because this is going to be, we're going to want to talk about so much, but really grounding it back to introducing yourself, Bruce, and your roles in the community, or however you want to do that.
Okay, yeah, Bruce Allan. I come from the Lheidli First Nation. I belong to the Tsamasu clan, Beaver clan, and I started out as an elementary school teacher. I'm a trained elementary school teacher, but I'll go more into detail of how I got to that point. But I ended up in post-secondary education where I was meant to be, I suppose. But teaching grade 1 for 2 years, definitely, if you can teach grade 1, you can teach anything. So.
And that's very much in the school system, isn't it? Like once, yeah.
Yeah, so it taught me a lot about myself, and along the way, I was born into a healing journey. My grandmother attended Leigh Jack. My father attended Leigh Jack. My mother was raised by a person, an auntie that went to Leigh Jack, so it's very much ingrained in my existence. So when I say I'm born into a healing journey, that's where I come from, and it took me a while to, even graduating from post-secondary, it took me a while to get into the path of healing, but I'm pretty sure it was all meant to be, so to get me to where I am today. What else more about myself? I have 5 boys of my own, and I've raised other 5 children. My youngest is 18. My oldest grandchild is 21, so he's older than 2 of his uncles. Yeah, that seems to be what it's like in Indigenous country. But yeah, the healing journey, when I was, just before coming here, I was thinking about when the Pope died. And that kind of brought a lot of things. I attended the gathering in Edmonton when the Pope came to Canada, and when he passed away, before that what brought him to Canada was Kamloops.
Right.
And so Kamloops was a different, it set me off on a different path. I worked with survivors. I've always worked with survivors, and then when Kamloops happened, it just brought everything from the stories that I heard from listening to survivors tell their stories. They all said, they witnessed something and they weren't believed. And when Kamloops happened, it just, okay, it's going to be out there. And I was working the crisis line, talking to survivors about when they heard the Kamloops thing happen, and they would share their own stories. And then the Toronto Star phoned up and said, okay, what are you guys doing? And I said who I worked for and what I do, and then they printed that story in the newspaper, and then all of a sudden I just got flooded with calls from the media, CTV, CBC, the Netherlands, Australia, China.
You shared your story about what you've been through personally.
Yeah, I did share with them, yeah, and there was many interviews that's what I did. So talking about being sent to Leigh Jack, but in a different sense than my grandmother and my father. And I went as a day student, so I got on the bus in the morning, went to the school, got on the bus and came home. So it's a different dynamic, and I can't say it's not as bad as being a resident there, because day students experience pretty much the same abuses that a resident would. But
Can we go back to this piece? And this is my therapy hat, and we've just met, but I'm kind of expressing my bias. And so when you talked about working with the people, that you've always worked with the people, working with survivors,
yep.
Within your understanding, as an educator, and bringing your own story into it, how does that enter, kind of blend, or what does that look like? Because obviously somebody like a therapist, a clinician, a social worker might approach it kind of from a different perspective. But when you're in it, you telling your story is a huge bridge, I suspect, and having the empathy and
Indigenous
connection.
worldviews are different when it comes to education or teaching,
Right.
too. So it's a different
We're
way
so
of
siloed,
teaching.
right? And it's just like,
Yeah.
well, you have to have this degree behind your name to do this, and this certification, and this code of ethics, and all of that. That's very colonial.
Yeah, Western worldview is very much you don't put your story in, right?
Right.
But Indigenous worldview would be that story is everything. Yeah.
Yeah, so how that really became focused on residential school survivors was I was working back in my community and the Psychos community as a upgrading instructor with our people who dropped out of high school and things like that, and also having been in a position as a band counselor in my nation. And we would bring in facilitators and people who were working on healing.
Yeah.
And so we invited Bill Mussel from the Stalo Nation. He's one of the more prominent counselors in our territory, trained a lot of our people and counseled a lot of our people. And so he came in and did a residential school workshop, and we had circles in the school. We had circles, and we invited a lot of the elders from Lheidli T'enneh, and they would come and they would share what happened to them
Right.
at Leigh. And a lot of those stories were quite horrific. And that, this is 1992, and at that time nobody was talking.
No.
Nobody at all was talking. It was the first time, and it was Bill Mussel's, the way he did things, and it was really interesting because he would take us on walks. Being a counselor, right? He would walk with us and counsel us without us really knowing we're being counseled. And
40
so,
years later, we call that forest therapy, and we think that we've invented it, right? But
yeah,
back in '92, that's just
and that's what kind of just focused
way,
my attention to the survivors. And I know years earlier, when my father passed in '79, I was very angry at the person who ran him over. Oh, he was drunk, and it was all his fault, and there was this huge anger that I carried for many years. And it just, when Bill came in, I asked the question, okay, how did my father die? Well, he died because he was drinking and he was walking on the road, and but the bigger question was, alcohol was a symptom.
yeah.
And that's what I got from Bill's conversations. And then I thought about why was my dad on the road? Why was he drunk? Why did he drink? Was the biggest question that I had to answer. Why did he drink? And we started to look at what he went through. He went to Leigh and he went to Kamloops. And after he left Kamloops, graduated with a grade 12, he drank all the time.
Yeah.
Why did he drink all the time? And he never shared any stories with me, but he showed it.
Right.
Yeah. So, and just from learning from talking to survivors, talking to people who my dad went to school with, actually sitting in IAP hearings to support survivors while they're telling their story to the government to get compensation. I sat in hearings where the people that my dad went to school with told their stories.
Yeah.
And what they told, you know, my dad was not immune to that.
No.
So for me, that was healing, even though it was horrific.
And that's, I think, one of the keys to kind of the theme of this year is that intergenerational and how that kind of starts to unfold, right?
Yeah.
And so, you know, you're telling your experience, but then you're talking about the linkage to a traumatic grief with your father, but then having that have to unfold, right? Because you're stuck with the pain of that hatred and that anger and that rage of the circumstance, right? Which kind of stirs everything up. But then it's just like, I don't want to hold this for the rest of my life, right? Because that's the poison that I'm holding as a result. And so then you get this seed.
So you talked about, you know, driving over here and thinking about how the Pope dying has affected, like what has it stirred back up?
Oh, yeah. It just brought back a lot of those. There's a lot of survivors who attended the event in Edmonton, and they were pretty much divided. But as a support person, you can't tell them, okay, I'm on your side, and no, I'm on your side. Like, there's people that hate the Catholic Church and the Pope and all that, but there's also those elders that, you know, they just praise him and they just look up to them, and you can't tell them either or, you know, you have to support them for where they're at.
Because it's the timepiece.
Yeah.
When we look at trauma not being date stamped, right? And so is your trauma here, where there's no separation between the Catholic Church and whoever the Pope was back then and today?
Yep.
Because when you're triggered, right, you're just drawn into the unfinished business.
Yeah, and for me, when I was doing that support, I also was thinking that, well, this guy stands for all of the traumas that our people went through, including my father's, and it needed to be acknowledged. And in some ways, at the time, you know, I didn't think about it, but he did say, "Oh yeah, this was a genocide on the church's behalf."
And that was the first pope to use that language.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think people wanted more and more to be added. But I think, and he started on a path. And
how important is acknowledgement for healing?
I think because there's lots of denialism right now in society, and even in our own institutions, like the post-secondary institution that I work for, there's denialism there. There's denialism in other universities and society, and politicians, especially politicians, that are denying. It's everywhere, and it kind of irks me, but at the same time, they really don't know, and they don't. It doesn't seem like they want to learn, even though they do say, "Yeah, I do know about that." But
so caring about healing, like caring about a survivor's healing, and just that moment of acknowledgement, what it does inside for somebody. Like, is it important that non-Indigenous people acknowledge the truth, or the people who are leadership that have impact in decision making, that they acknowledge the truth? Like, how important is acknowledgement to that truth?
I think I receive that every day when I talk to students. They say things like, I didn't know this, I never knew this happened, and I've heard parts of it in elementary school, I heard parts of it in secondary school, And it wasn't until I got here that I heard the full extent of what actually happened. And you start seeing documentaries like Sugarcane come out, and then you have movies like Bones of Crows and Indian Horse and all of these movies that are all based on the actual experiences of survivors and our intergenerational survivors. Like, I never heard my dad say anything about what happened to him at all. But I learned from his peers, and that for me was the acknowledgement that, okay, now I know why my dad was the way he was, why he drank the way he drank, and how the traumas affected him, and how that's passed down to us. And so there was a lot of healing that came from that, and working with survivors, going through what they had to go through, like bringing in guest speakers or facilitators and therapists and counselors to talk to them. Whatever I was bringing elders to go through, I had to go through myself.
Yeah.
So the healing path, just, it involved a lot of elders, but it involved a lot of people that worked in counseling, worked in traditional healing practices, doing a fasting ceremony myself, helped out quite a bit.
Tell me more about that. What does that look like within your tradition or your practice?
Well, I was working in a project called Healing the Healers, and what we did was gather a number of elders from 11 different communities and just said, okay, let's go through this together. Let's start talking about what the residential school experience did to you, or what happened to you. The women were more open. They opened up, and they the healing started right away for them. The men, no way. They started to make jokes about the traumas that they went through, and they would not open up. They would not talk.
Safeguarding.
Yeah, they just. It was, the men were the hardest to work with, but.
But you modeled it as a male. You were already well along your path, and when you described this opportunity to teach the next generation, right, being given that opportunity to kind of clarify and add to the knowledge, but then you've still got this residual politicians and higher ups and the ones who hold the power, where there's a mismatch of how much acknowledgement there is. Right? I mean, some people think that reconciliation is just a formula, or you know what I mean? Like, just insert this, this action here, and then we're off the hook. As opposed to, like, you're talking about the healing piece, but how it's intertwined with the culture, and intertwined with the settlers and where they're at.
I think acknowledgement is really important. Like, and I think that there's been so much gaslighting on a collective level. There's stereotypes towards Indigenous people that still cause so much harm, right? And like, that's some of the first things that I find non-Indigenous people want to unpack and unlearn. But first they have to be brave enough to share what their stereotype has been, whether that's generationally handed down to them too, and it's so harmful. But it's that socialization that happened that was like, well, to legitimize the horrific acts that was happening, they demoralized and dehumanized Indigenous peoples, just like a gaslighting, and then created this smear campaign against Indigenous people. And people are still unlearning that. So actually talking about that racism that most non-Indigenous Canadians have somewhere within them, and we have to name it in order to actually have truth and reconciliation. And
that's a tough one.
But the lens from Indigenous people, do you actually need acknowledgement from your abuser to heal? But there does need to be acknowledgement. Like, can non-Indigenous Canadians help the healing process for Indigenous people if they turn and acknowledge?
Yeah.
Do you think so?
Yeah.
Can it help Indigenous people heal if non-Indigenous Canadians just stop the denialism and they fully acknowledge and hold space for? And what does that
Yeah.
look like?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have to look at our own population. There's a lot of traumas that happened and that came from the residential schools, but the residential schools have long since been closed, and those behaviors are in our communities today. And how do we acknowledge that's going on today? And that's part of the healing process, is to say, okay, this is in our communities, whether it's in our families, and it's in our leadership as well. Sad to say, but that's what's happening. And so we have to have people that are brave enough to come forward and share those things. So that was the learning process, working with those elders and going through, making them go through counseling sessions. And okay, you guys are, I'm going to do it because just to show that you guys can do it too. So I did the same things as what they needed to do. We brought them to conferences, residential school conferences and sexual abuse conferences in Edmonton, and so there was a lot of work, and we just barely scratched the surface in 4 years, and we still have a long ways to go, but I think that was the start of it. A lot of those elders are gone now, but a lot of their teachings are still with me. I can remember working with one elder, and there's a few elders that are gone now, but just the things that they shared, and they were able to travel some of their healing journey with everybody, and going through it together, but also it wasn't always hard work. It was some of it was fun, and a lot of it was hard work. Doing the fasting ceremony, what I asked the medicine man for was the strength to work with survivors.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's what I gave him, tobacco and colors, and before I started the fast. And at the end of it, he said, "Yeah, you've got it now." And
I love that conversation about community, because that kind of puts into context kind of what you were talking about, Auroara, in the sense of, do you need this in order for this? That's kind of a linear thought process, right? And if you look at it in the individual sense, right, what do you do if your abuser isn't sorry? What do you do if the feedback that you're getting from, the local Catholic congregation or whatever isn't on point, isn't acknowledging, right? I feel many times that I'm on the hot seat as a settler. And, I have peers who have no awareness, just zero awareness. And so they're saying, well, I'm not responsible for this. This happened 200 years ago, or this, and so I don't want to feel bad about being white. And it's just like, hold on, let's back up the bus here. Because as I was sharing, I thought I entered my journey with regards to connections with Indigenous people without any bias, because I had no people around me to kind of be biased, and my folks were good people, my folks are good people, right? And so they're definitely not going to be overtly racist, but we live in a racist culture.
Yeah.
Right?
Woven.
Woven. And so it's only once you have knowledge that then you're responsible for how do you deal with that knowledge, right? And so it's like, my first 4 years of social work education in Manitoba, it's just like gobsmacked, with regards to kind of hearing, starting to hear some of those experiences about residential schools and the Louis Riel and the rebellion and kind of all the political, some of it's glorified militaristic stuff, right?
Yeah.
But some of it is just horrific. And if you have that empathy, you kind of go, I can't imagine kind of being in that position. And so that's where I think as a settler, there's this constant responsibility.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about your perspective. We sometimes get hung up on language, but you hear the terminology as, well, I'm an ally. And I recently heard from a narrative therapist how a person using that terminology can have all the focus on themselves, like feeling better, because it's like, I put the little rubber stamp to say I'm an ally.
And you actually can't self-identify as an ally, and I recently learned that too, that they're an ally because someone says that they're an ally,
Right.
because they're actually doing contributive work and coming from that place that is conducive to healing and regenerating and truth and reconciliation, right? You can't, I'm an ally, like you said, just like you can't go, I'm an elder, or I'm a healer, or whatever.
Show me
it
the
is.
money, right?
Yeah.
Like action. It happens in action.
Someone else might put that on you because it's warranted.
I'm curious, Bruce, if as you're on this healing journey, as you're kind of connecting the dots, and as you're, not only working on yourself, but you're working with others, you're working, as a community context, how much of the work is nonverbal? I use the word energy or universe or whatever, but even sitting in this space, holding this space, like this is a sacred circle of three.
Yeah.
And with our diversity, right? And this is the exciting thing about not a dual relationship where it's just you and the interviewer.
Yeah.
So to kind of be a threesome like this, this is why I'm here. Right, is that I feel like I'm a contributor, I'm a listener, I'm part of the circle.
The narrative of truth and reconciliation and being so important, where you're willing to examine your biases, which models then to other non-Indigenous Canadians that might be watching, because you're willing to name that you have biases, right? And then you can thread them and talk about it, right?
Yeah.
That's really important part for us to move forward and to not have anger come up if there are ignorances or mistakes made, right? Because we won't move forward if we can't converse through it. We can't move forward if those courageous, uncomfortable conversations have to happen.
So do you feel that energy of that? Like when just things come to a wall, when you're in a community context where you've got somebody who's just...
So when you're talking about energy, we're talking about spirituality in our communities.
Yeah.
And I think a large part of my own healing came from that spirituality aspect, because I talk to a lot of people who are spiritual healers and spiritual people. The person that was running the fast, his name was Joe P. Cardinal, and he was the medicine man, and very spiritual guy, but also a funny guy. As you can tell from his last name, and one of the things that happened to him is that he got kicked out of the Catholic Church because of his beliefs in spirituality and all of that, and
like Indigenous.
Yeah, and he tells them, well, you can't kick me out of the church. I'm a cardinal. You get that humor.
It's almost like tenure, right?
Yeah.
As a professor, right? It's just like you're stuck with me.
Yeah.
Once you reach a certain stage.
But the spiritual part of things, always comes across my path, even when I'm teaching.
Yeah.
I would tell my healing story. I would tell a certain part of my healing story where how I got rid of my headaches was through a dream. I requested the help of a dreamer because the doctor and the eye doctor couldn't get rid of my headaches. And so I shared that story, and then you kind of get those looks like, oh yeah, right, and you're crazy, or
because it doesn't fit Western medicine, right?
Right.
It's like, we didn't do an MRI and you didn't get this drug, or whatever.
And so I asked the class, do you ever get the sense that you tell a story and people look at you like you're crazy? And then this lady at the back slowly puts up her hand, and she goes, yeah, I got one of those. And she goes, I attended a sweat in Fort St. James. And it was too hot for me, and I said, all my relations opened the door, and she got out. And they closed the door after she got out and carried on. There was nobody else out there, and she went to sit outside on the south side of the sweat lodge, and she shapeshifted. She was a wolf when she came out on the side. She looked down, she seen her paws, and then she looked around to see if anybody else seen it. And so, yeah, I guess people would look at you like you're crazy, but
there's certain times that you don't want to have a conversation with a psychiatrist, right? Because it's like, ooh, psychotic break, we need to lock them up.
Yeah.
As opposed to, this is just the journey.
Yeah.
Right?
It turns out she works with energy, and she's a psychic.
Right, of course.
Yeah. And so I had her in my class, and then she would, at the end of class, she'd wait for people to leave, and she goes, there's a lady at the door. She's really too shy to come in. She doesn't want to come in. And I said, oh yeah, what does she look like? And she described my great auntie that helped raise me up. Yeah, she's just coming to check on you. And so now, like, when I think about my healing journey, I know I'm not the one that's doing all the work. I've got spirit guides, and
you're surrounded by your ancestors.
Surrounded by my ancestors, and that's not, every day it comes back like that. I went to run my first marathon in Vancouver, and a buddy of mine's a psychic, and he's sitting across from me, and he looks up and behind me, and he's looking like that, and he goes, oh, this must be a pretty big race. And I go, yeah, it's a marathon. It's 26 miles or 42 kilometers, and he goes, yeah, I can tell. He's looking at all of the spirit guides, and
you've got a lot of support.
Yeah, says, yeah, there's lots of people behind you. So.
Well, and that's after your fasting too, where you put that intention to help all of the survivors, right?
Yeah.
So I do want to just bring it back to your story where you weren't on a healing journey yet. You had all that pain inside that you recognized, and that anger. And what was the pivotal moment for you where you released that anger and that pain and you started that journey so pronouncedly? Was there a defined moment?
I think approaching my cousin who accidentally ran over my father, and saying that, I know it was an accident, it wasn't your fault, and I forgive you for that. And before that, there was just the anger and hatred between families that occurred because of that, and carrying that for years and being angry and enraged and all the time. And then once I approached him and forgave him, that lifted a huge weight.
What made you ready to forgive?
Just talking to Bill Muscle and just getting the bigger picture instead of that incident.
Yeah.
of being in a highway accident, just not that incident. It's way bigger than that, and it had to do with how my father was raised, and it had to do with how much the traumas affected him to make him behave the way he behaved, and pass that on to us.
So context was really important in order to step out of that, like being immersed in the pain soup, right? Like for me, I've felt that before, where it's just feels like you're in the broth of it, and it's like I don't want to be in that broth anymore. Forgiveness was important to me too in my journey for freeing, but then I also had the knowledge that we can never impose on someone that they should forgive.
Yes.
So I never know exactly how to approach supporting someone finding forgiveness, because I don't want to say they have to, even though I know
Right.
it's incredibly crucial.
And some people get totally triggered by that word forgiveness,
Yeah.
Yep.
right? And so that's kind of from the therapy point of view, right? So it's like, just like you're saying, Auroara, you don't impose it on them. You don't sometimes even identify it until they start sharing. They start using their language. So if they use the word forgiveness, you go with it. But if there's religious abuse, then it's just letting go, right?
So
There's other ways of describing the same journey.
How do you support elders? Like, do you ever share that forgiveness is helpful?
Not so much. I don't. I ask them questions. How you doing? A lot of them do come from that anger background, and they've healed themselves traditionally to get past that and see themselves where they're at. But yeah, how to get them to that healing place is, it's totally up to them. You can't force them, but you just share, how you did it, and
That's the key piece, right? You're just sharing your journey, starting a conversation, just like we are here, having a conversation. We're feeding off each other in the sense of trying to understand. And
so there's so many of those elders that are gone now that I know they're still with me. So, because
Beautiful.
of the journeys we went through together, and the stories that they shared, and just the funny things that they shared always sticks in my mind, and the teachings that they left with me always comes back. And, I remember those.
So what did, when you forgave your cousin, what did that open up for you and your cousin?
That released him, and he was in a downward spiral at the time. And then once I gave him those words, we became brothers. We became brothers. That I was able to forgive him, and we'd go bowling together. We played ball together, and every time I see him, it's not like it was in the past. It was all hatred and anger, and now it's love.
Right, because it was stuck. Like I was just, it hit me so hard when you talked about this wasn't just this anonymous person who hit your father. Like this was somebody who was in your community, in your family, like in your circle, and to have that trauma bond created.
Shared pain.
The shared, okay, thank you. The shared pain of that is huge. And so it sounded like you were ready, like you were doing your work.
Yeah.
You were ready to let go of that, right? You weren't waiting for your cousin to say X, Y, and Z before you were going to shift, right? And so the responsibility is our own pain to kind of deal with. This is our shit pile. And this pile of shit, we're just tired of sitting in it. And so I have to figure out a way of getting out of that.
Yeah.
And then there's timing within that journey to say, oh, yeah, this person is connected to my pile. And so I think I need to share with them that I'm letting go,
And that love.
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And then seeing the excitement of change in that other individual. Like, that's not your purpose, but it's the fruit of.
Yep.
Right.
Like, amazing.
Yeah, he stopped drinking and drugging shortly after too.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because he was holding on to that.
Yeah.
And that's intergenerational cycle healing right
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
He's transforming pain, anger, shame. And shame is so huge with it all, right? It's the hardest one to work through, move through, because you don't want to feel the
Yeah.
shame. And then bringing it to that place of love.
And we still have those kinds of things going on in our families right now, the feuds that the children and grandchildren have to uphold the hatred of that family because grandma.
I've seen that, yeah.
That's the modern day Hatfield and McCoys as they.
Yeah, and we still have
I don't know
to
what that is.
work through that. Yeah.
So, I mean, when people bounce pain to one another too, it just circulates in the community then. And when thinking about community wellness and healing those cycles, like, it is actually just going, well, why keep carrying the anger, pain, shame, sadness, guilt, like hatred, like all of those things? Like, why keep holding it?
Mm-hmm.
And actually be willing to let it transform to love, even if you want to hold on to it. It's like, no, but I don't want to let that story go because that happened.
Right, but that's the exciting. That's the exciting part. Like, one of the things I talk about is being self-full, not selfish. And so this is a fantastic example of you're doing your work. Mm-hmm. You're focusing on kind of what the creator is kind of letting you know. This is the next step. This is the next step. This is the next step. And then you're full of the focus of yourself. And then you're recognizing where that overflows to other people. Right? And the timing of that sharing with your cousin, you know, and then that just exploding, that healing salve, that healing medicine, just flows, you know, because it's not just you and your cousin. That's going to impact multiple generations, I suspect, and.
But also the lives that you've touched. Like,
Yeah.
I bump into so many people that say Bruce Allan taught me, and taught years ago, like 20 years, 20 plus years you've been teaching at the college here and impacting so many people's lives, and then also elders' lives. So when you transform that, it obviously opened up for you to benefit from, but also all those who you touched.
Yeah, there's so many stories from the elders. Like, I remember one elder, she didn't feel worthy enough to sit in a restaurant to eat. She wasn't, you know, she didn't feel that she deserved to be in a public place to enjoy a meal, and she didn't feel that she had the right.
Internal shame.
Yeah, and to get her from that mindset to, you know, you are worth it, and your stories will help lots of people, and she did. But she's passed on now, but there's other elders too that I always remember their stories. They're so funny. Like, when you're in your 80s and 90s, you don't have a filter.
That's the exciting thing, right? You have less F's to give, as they say.
Yeah. I remember, in my younger years, I remember this elder saying, I'm going to go to hell my own way. Like, very strong Catholic and all that, and okay. Yeah, everything's coming out, and they will just say it. They won't hold it back. They'll just say it. Yeah.
The gift of age.
Yeah, they'll just say it, and some of them are just hilarious. Just an example of these two elders that I worked with or worked with me. Tom George was a really good person that got me thinking too, like, okay, you gotta you got to stay on the path, on this path, even though right now you're not in a good place to do it, but I'm going to just hang around with you. And then this other elder that I worked with who would come to the gatherings, healing gatherings, he would come there intoxicated. That was his way of dealing with the residential school. But he turned out to be just the funniest guy, but eventually became one of our best elders to work with the next generations. He ended up staying at the healing camp from May till October.
Wow.
Every year.
And that's the interesting piece when you're kind of don't judge the symptoms.
Yeah.
Yep.
Like it's like, this is the gift. I heard one medicine woman say to some people that I was working with, this is the gift of alcohol. Thank you, alcohol, for providing us the context of keeping us contained and helping kind of push it to the side. And now we're curious about when the alcohol is done and we're ready for the next step, right? So not judgment and shame and imposing guilt, right? Because with that elder that you're talking about, right, they needed the lubrication
To show up, to face
to
the reality.
literally be in the space.
Yeah.
And again, a lot of the siloed kind of white medicine would say, well, you can't learn anything when you're drunk. Right? Like, why would you even bother with somebody who's intoxicated?
Yeah.
And it's just like, well, there's spirits there.
They made it there, and that brought up a lot, just facing the reality, just opening the doorway.
Celebrate the fact that they're here.
And they
and then-
don't have other coping skills yet.
And then maybe we've got a responsibility to keep them safe within this space,
Yep.
depending on what our role is.
Yeah.
Right?
I just let him go. He came in like that. We had jackets, healing the healer jackets,
Yeah.
and
Wow.
and he would be in the bar with the healer.
Using both tools.
Yeah. So, and the other elders were saying, "Kick him out, get him out, get him out of here. We don't want him to represent us like that." And I just say, just hang on.
But you have that gift of seeing the wider context that was given to you, that helped you, that then you carry forward for others.
Yeah.
So just finishing up here, what would you want to share to viewers or like people who are tuned into this that they can do for their generational cycle healing?
Yeah.
I think the younger generations are really curious, and they want to know why their parents and grandparents are the way they are. And it's really important for those generations to let the younger generation know. And even if you told a story 10 times and they're getting tired of, I see that in my own kids. Oh yeah, I heard that story already. But yeah, they need to hear from the older generations on the journeys that they've gone, because a lot of them don't know. Why are my grandparents like that? Why is it that my grandparents don't hug me or say I love you or
Wow.
where does that come from? And just that. And that curiosity of the next generations to learn why they are where they are. Like when we're talking about language, there's an urgency to have the language taught to the younger generations, even to the teaching them at preschool, so that the seed is planted so that they can start speaking.
Yeah.
And right now, a lot of our younger people don't have the language. They don't have that connection to the land and to the elders. So I think that's what we need to do, is make that connection to the land.
You remind me, and I think I've said this before in this show, is the teacher shows up when the student's ready. And so you might have told that story 20 times, but it was on deaf ears. And then all of a sudden, you know, the audience, the student kind of has the ears and is interested in kind of figuring out the next layer of that. And then you get to be the teacher.
Yep.
It's your honor to kind of share that story, kind of with eager ears listening, like the difference, right, between, you know, facing a bunch of students who are sleeping or whatever on their phones in the back of the class versus, you know, the ones in the front of the room that are just like hanging on your every word.
Yeah. And a lot of those teachings too come with traditional stories, very humorous stories. I think the ones with humorous stories will definitely stick with you.
It's a great way of teaching, yeah.
It'll stick with you, and you'll remember that person forever.
Yeah.
And then you share what they shared with you, and you know, you put a smile on people's faces from that person that's gone. Yeah, gone already.
Yeah.
And so they're still alive yet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Spiritual, generational.
Yeah. So that's ongoing. We're still a long ways to go in our communities, but that all you can do is what you can do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, Bruce, you've really reminded us when we kind of expanded the format of this show from half an hour to an hour. And with a few of our guests, we go, okay, this is part one.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah.
Right? Because I could sit here all morning with this energy and with I mean, we're at the tip of the iceberg that you're sharing with us today.
Yeah.
And I'm just so honored that you came and
Me too.
yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Like you
For
said,
inviting me,
you can do what you can do.
Yeah.
Hey? So thank you all for tuning in to this episode, and wherever you're at in your journey, you know, you can do what you can do. And I think Bruce Allan said it best here today. Thank you.